David is up. You should start.
All right. So thanks. I hope we have just about everybody back. It looks like we maybe do. Welcome back. And I want to thank the previous panel for what just a fabulous presentation and for staying on time so we had plenty of time for questions. So being so fortunate to have such a stellar group of activists and policy experts today. We will have time again for questions after this next panel. So please drop your questions in the chat. We'll do our best to get to as many as possible. Please feel free to direct your question to a specific speaker or simply direct it to the panel at large. If you would start in the chat, my question is, if you have a question, it'll be a little quicker for me to be able to differentiate the actual questions from the comments in the chat that's going on in the chat. So without further ado, let me introduce this next outstanding panel to you. Tong Zhao is a senior fellow in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, based in Beijing at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. His research focuses on strategic security issues such as nuclear weapons policy, deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation, missile defense, hypersonic weapons, and China's security and foreign policy. Mian is a physicist and co-director of Princeton University's program on science and global security, part of the School of Public and International Affairs. An expert on the policy and technical aspects of nuclear weapons, he received the 2014 Linus Pauling Legacy Award for, quote, accomplishments as a scientist and as a peace activist in contributing to the global effort for nuclear disarmament and for a more peaceful world, end quote. In 2018, Zhao was selected as one of the 60 faces of CND by the UK Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament to mark its 60th anniversary. He received the American Physical Society's 2019 Leo Slizard Award for promoting global peace and nuclear disarmament. Zhao serves on the board of the Arms Control Association and on the steering committee of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. Joseph Gerson is a leading figure in the US and international disarmament and peace movements. He is president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, vice president of the International Peace Bureau, and co-founder of the Committee for a Sane US-China Policy, and convener of the US-based Asia-Pacific Working Group, and co-convener of the Peace and Planet International Network. His books include Empire and the Bomb, How the US Uses Nuclear Weapons to Dominate the World. Finally, Kennette Benedict is a lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago and senior advisor to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. From 2005 to 2015, Kennette served as executive director and publisher of the Bulletin, the leading scholarly magazine about threats to humanity from nuclear weapons, climate change, emerging technologies, and probably most famously known for the Doomsday Clock. She publishes articles and gives media interviews about nuclear weapons and disarmament, democracy and the bomb, and global governments. From 1991 to 2005, Kennette was Director of International Peace and Security at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, overseeing grant-making on a broad international security agenda. She also directed a grant-making program in Russia from 1992 to 2001, and an initiative on science, technology, and security from 2000 to 2005. Previously, she taught at the University of Illinois, at Urbana-Champaign, and at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. She received her BA from Oberlin College and her PhD in political science from Stanford University. So each speaker will have 8 minutes. I'll give a 1-minute warning. So I will turn it over now to Tong Zhao.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here. I think from the mainstream Chinese perspective, no first use policy is a very important component of a gradualist approach of achieving nuclear disarmament. So the view is we really need to adopt no first use in order to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. And no first use is also imperative to adopting a minimum nuclear deterrent strategy. And Chinese officials have argued that we need to look at the history of prohibiting chemical and biological weapons because in that history, we were only able to prohibit chemical and biological weapons after we have banned the use of such weapons through the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Similarly, they argue if we want to prohibit nuclear weapons, we also need to ban the use of nuclear weapons first. And to achieve that, we need to ban the first use of nuclear weapons first. So no first use is a very important step in achieving eventual nuclear disarmament. And also it brings a lot of benefit to promote the goal of nuclear non-proliferation. Because if nuclear weapon states have to use nuclear weapons to deter non-nuclear security threats, then it would be very hard for them to argue that the other countries who do not possess nuclear weapons today should not pursue their own nuclear weapons to protect themselves. So from this perspective, nuclear weapon states really need to adopt no first use policy to convince the non-nuclear weapon states that there is really little value for them to pursue nuclear weapons. And in addition to that, no first use policy can provide a lot of important security benefits, including to nuclear weapon states themselves. If two countries, two nuclear rivals, for example, have credible mutual no first use policies, then because neither side would use nuclear weapons first, a mutual no first use policy would basically amount to a mutual no use policy. And in that regard, a lot of current security problems among nuclear weapon states would disappear. For example, they wouldn't need to worry about missile defense, for example. In that case, the US would be able to develop missile defense to counter the perceived threat from North Korea without causing a serious threat perception in Russia and China. You know, that's a very ideal scenario, but it really shows that if nuclear weapon states could adopt credible mutual no first use policies, that would help improve their security relations between themselves. Today, missile defense and other issues have really poisoned the security relations among nuclear weapon states. And the mutual no first use agreements or policies could really help resolve that problem. And today, China is facing increasing international pressure to join global arms control regime. And for China to do so, many Chinese experts have argued that the other nuclear weapon states, including the United States, need to adopt no first use. Some Chinese experts believe that to broaden the adoption of no first use may be a precondition for China to be willing to join more arms control institutions. But other nuclear weapon states, including the United States, have basically rejected this no first use policy, partly because they don't believe that no first use policy can be made credible. They don't really trust China's no first use. So it looks like if we want to move things forward, we need to discuss how we can make no first use policies credible. Some people argue that the Chinese no first use policy is not credible because it's basically an empty political commitment. There is no domestic institutional constraint on Chinese supreme leaders' capacity to violate its no first use policy. And some people also argued that over the years, Chinese overall nuclear capabilities have changed significantly. China today is pursuing an advanced nuclear triad capability, and its nuclear stockpile is projected to double within 10 years, according to the assessment of American intelligence community. And even some of China's traditional nuclear postures may be changing over time. For example, some people believe, including many officials in the US government, that China is gradually shifting towards putting a portion of its nuclear weapons under high alert during peacetime, and even potentially shifting towards a launch on warning nuclear posture in the future after China acquires an early warning capability. So people have questions that do these changes in Chinese nuclear capabilities and postures affect the credibility of China's traditional no first use policy?
One minute, Tong.
Sure. So,
Thank you.
So maybe countries like United States and China should discuss a set of criteria that they can commonly agree about how to make no first use policies credible in the future. What kinds of nuclear capabilities, postures, domestic legal institutions would contribute to such credibility. So I will stop here and look forward to the comments of the other experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Tong, and I also want to thank you for being up in the middle of the night to join us. So we appreciate that sacrifice. Zia Mian.
Thank you, Cole. I want to first commend the organizers for putting in the enormous effort to convene this conversation among activists and scholars and former officials and people from the communities to talk about this issue of no first use of nuclear weapons. Given how little time we have, let me just kind of be a little telegraphic. It's important to remember that the issue of the conditions under which nuclear weapons might be used is actually the oldest debate in the field of nuclear strategy. It's actually older than nuclear weapons themselves. Even before the very first nuclear weapon had been assembled or tested, there was a debate in the US among the scientists who were working to make that first atomic bomb about what were the conditions under which this bomb might be used and what would it mean. And there was actually a petition from some of the Manhattan Project scientists to the US president on the issue of the first use of nuclear weapons, which was expected to be against Japan at that time. And they actually urged the president not to use nuclear weapons. against any civilian or other target in Japan. They also, in a very important observation, which I think bears on our conversation today, they said that it shouldn't be left to any leader of any country alone to make that decision about the first use of nuclear weapons. And they actually urged that any decision about the possible use of nuclear weapons should actually be taken by the international community and with the support of public opinion, given that this was a decision of such enormous consequence. But as history shows, their advice and suggestion about how to think about such a profoundly consequential step was ignored, and the United States then dropped nuclear weapons on Japan, first on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki. And those uses of nuclear weapons, you have to remember, were against a country that didn't have nuclear weapons. And it wasn't about deterrence, and it wasn't about retaliation or anything like that. It was the first use of nuclear weapons against somebody who couldn't retaliate with nuclear weapons. And at that stage, it was against somebody who couldn't retaliate against the United States at all, in fact. And I think this is the first observation I want to make, which is that so much of our conversation so far has been about nuclear war and the consequences for Americans and the people of the planet as a whole about what happens with the use of nuclear weapons. Steve Gallant talked about nuclear war, Ira Helfand talked about nuclear winter, and so on. And all of these things are true and important. But if you actually think about it, the only uses of nuclear weapons, which were first uses, were against people who didn't have nuclear weapons and couldn't retaliate. And if you look at the threats by the United States, which are the threats we know the most about, throughout the history of the Cold War, by and large, they have been against countries who did not have nuclear weapons. Whether it was against North Korea during the Korean War, or against China during the Korean War, or against China during the Taiwan crisis between 1954 and 1958, or whether it was against Vietnam in the 1960s. And if you continue forward, even in the post-Cold War period, some of us will remember the discussions under the Bush administration about developing bunker buster bombs. And who were they to be used against? Countries that didn't have nuclear weapons. And so we have to keep in mind that a conversation about the first use and no first use of nuclear weapons should be broader than just the prospect of nuclear war where we ourselves would be in danger. A far more credible risk of the first use of nuclear weapons would in fact be against somebody who couldn't retaliate, where there wouldn't be the prospect of escalation to large-scale nuclear war. And just in that context, for those who read the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, there's an article that's just appeared based on a public opinion polling work done by a scholar in Israel. And they found that 60% of Israelis now, who they surveyed, would approve of the use of an Israeli nuclear weapon against Iran, even though Iran does not have nuclear weapons. And this echoes a similar finding by the Stanford political scientist Scott Sagan from a couple of years ago, that 60% of Americans, when asked, would support the use of an American nuclear weapon against an Iranian city if American troops were actually in harm's way. So the point I want to make here is that thinking about asking presidents to adopt declaratory policies or even passing laws about nuclear use and whether Congress should be involved in any decision needs to keep in mind the political context within which decisions are made. Because it's so significant that when political leaders make decisions about consequential issues, they're either made in secret where the public won't know, as we saw in the case, for example, of the US use of torture during the war on terror, and of surveillance of Americans and others, that Snowden revealed. But even having Congress involved would not necessarily change the political calculus that's at work, which is that knowing that the vast majority of Americans might support such a decision, they might go along with it. So one has to ask the question, as Tong Zhao quite rightly pointed out, what are the restraints that one can put in place on the decision-making process that go beyond just the enlightenment of a political leader, or even of a few political leaders or a political institution? And there I think that there is no substitute for a clear commitment by the public that they would not accept the use of nuclear weapons in their name as an action by their government.
1 minute,
one of the key tasks we have to pose to ourselves is, how do we create that condition? Because in my mind, that is a necessary condition for creating the context within which any political decision or any political judgment would have to be made. And I'll end with just this observation that as we watch the slaughter, the disproportionate use of violence by Israel against Palestinians that is unfolding in our screens. I remember the first time I saw this, and this was 1982, when we watched the Israelis pound Beirut, watching a city being bombed day after day after day. And there was relative silence from peace movements and activists around the world. And I think we have to ask the question that in the absence of a direct political participation by the public in these questions, there's only so much that you can expect from any political leader or any political institution unless we create a different political context within which they make decisions, especially of something as profound as the first use of nuclear weapons. And I just want to end with saying that we are now in 2021, and 60 years ago, in November of 1961, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed a resolution, and I'll just quote this and I'll stop with this quote. And the quote from the General Assembly resolution of November 61 says, "Any state using nuclear and thermonuclear weapons is to be considered as violating the Charter of the United Nations, as acting contrary to the laws of humanity, and as committing a crime against mankind and civilization." There was no issue of first use or second use, any use. And it's that sensibility, I think, that we have to bring back into the public sensibility and into the sensibility of the international community, so that even the consideration of first use by anybody under any circumstance has to deal with the fact that there would be profound consequences domestically and internationally from considering such a decision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zia, and thank you for that final thought. I'll turn it over now to Joseph Gerson.
So I get my screen share up here. Thank you. Well, with today's time limits, I can't go into detail, but these books provide much of the history of U.S. First Sight doctrine and about U.S. preparations and threats to initiate nuclear war. I think we all appreciate President Biden's earlier sole use statements that make it unlikely that he would authorize a first strike. But he won't be president forever. And if you recall Ira Helfand's beginning here, the reality is that a second strike is morally unacceptable as well. Trump's firing, the next piece here. Slow, I'm sorry. Trump's fire and fury threats brought us back to the era of first strike nuclear coercion. We must also not forget the danger in the weeks following the January 6th coup attempt and Nancy Pelosi's desperate efforts with the Pentagon to ensure that a nuclear first strike command from Trump would not be honored. We heard about this a bit before. Those weeks were reminiscent of the Watergate era, when Secretary of Defense Schlesinger mandated that no significant military operations be undertaken without his authorization. To understand U.S. first strike doctrine, as Zia was saying, we need to understand the political context. and in this case, the imperial and empire nature of that context. We need to be aware that the United States began its overseas empire with its conquest in 1898. Leading geostrategists have long argued that whoever controls Eurasia dominates the world. And as the Congressional Research Service recently reported, US policymakers for the last several decades have chosen to pursue a goal of preventing the emergence of regional hegemons in Eurasia. And toward that end, the US military operations in recent decades appear to have been carried out in no small part in support of that goal. Since 1945, the United States has constructed a network of more than 200 military bases along China's periphery. These bases are now vulnerable to Chinese missiles, which is leading the US to deploy missile defenses to the region. Because missile defenses can also serve as shields to reinforce US first strike nuclear swords, you have in China a growing fear that the US could launch a first strike attack that would eliminate China's deterrent nuclear arsenal. It seems that China may be expanding its relatively small nuclear arsenal. And as Zhao was intimating, there is also a debate in China about the possibility of discontinuing its absolute commitment to no first use. We like to think that nuclear war is almost impossible, but Admiral Richard, who just retired as the Strategic Command's senior commander, signed out by saying that the US military must shift away from its principal assumption that nuclear employment is not possible to nuclear employment is very possible. And the US is on track now to spend up to $2 trillion to upgrade its nuclear arsenal and delivery systems for that omnicidal eventuality. Along with Taiwan, the South China Sea is now the most dangerous flashpoint that could trigger nuclear war. Most of the oil that fuels China's and other East Asian economies must transit the South China Sea, making it the geopolitical center of the struggle for world power. A blockade of the sea would shut down their economies. Provocative US, Chinese, and other naval and air operations are dangerously jousting for dominance in the sea, and they have already led to very dangerous incidents, which in the future could easily escalate beyond control. Turning to the US use of its first strike arsenal and doctrine, we have to begin with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, crimes against humanity which were not needed to end the war and which were opposed by the leading military figures of the time, Leahy, Eisenhower, and even Curtis LeMay. The determinative reasons for the A bombings were to bring the war to an immediate end in order to avoid having to share share influence with the Soviets in northern China, Manchuria, and Korea, makes them imperial bombs, and to terrorize Stalin and his coterie on the eve of the Cold War. Dan Ellsberg, who served as the senior nuclear advisor in the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations, explains that every US president, beginning with Truman, has prepared and or threatened to initiate nuclear war during international crises and wars. Nuclear weapons, he explains, are used like an armed robber who points his gun at someone's head. Whether or not the trigger is pulled, the gun has been used. In order to limit the cost of deploying troops and equipment around the world to enforce the US empire in the aftermath of World War II, and in order to focus US treasure on post-war economic development, Eisenhower adopted the massive retaliation doctrine. Military challenges to the US sphere of influence would be met with the terrorizing power of US nuclear weapons. I'll come back to some of these threats momentarily. These are the times that the United States prepared and threatened first-strike nuclear attacks in Asia. General MacArthur planned to drop nuclear bombs along the Chinese and North Korean border, leaving a belt of radioactive cobalt that could not be crossed for decades. Note especially 1953, when Eisenhower, when Eisenhower threatened to attack China in order to force it to accept a Korean armistice on terms acceptable to the United States. It had to do with the number of POWs to be released. That served as the model for Nixon's madman November 1969 ultimatum against North Vietnam that had US nuclear forces mobilized for 29 days, even including the stationing of nuclear weapons in US civilian airports like Logan here in Boston. It It was called off only when the military warned about the possible domestic dangers of the mobilization. During the Cold War, a Middle East war like today's Israel-Palestine war would have come with US nuclear threats. The 1973 war came to an end when Kissinger put US forces on a nuclear alert to ensure that the war's outcome served US interests. And in the run-ups to Bush's Iraq wars, the US has threatened and prepared nuclear attacks against the possibility that Saddam Hussein would attack the somewhat vulnerable gathering US forces. And you'll see a host of other times that the US prepared and threatened nuclear attacks to reinforce its Middle East hegemony. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, precipitated by Khrushchev to overcome US first strike capabilities, as we heard earlier, the odds were 50-50 that we'd have a nuclear war. With senior US officers violating their orders, we came perilously close to triggering nuclear winter. That SAC bombers were put on alert during the CIA's Guatemala coup brings Dr. Strangelove to mind. And throughout the Cold War, Berlin was the most consistently dangerous nuclear flashpoint. The US is not the only nation to have prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war, but no other nation has done it even a tenth of the number of times that the United States has. US first strike policy is more than a doctrine. We are currently moving to deploy more usable battlefield weapons to Europe, nuclear weapons to Europe, low-yield warheads for submarines off China's coast, and there is a debate over deploying intermediate-range missiles to Europe and Asia. What to do? Press Congress to pass the Markey-Liu and, we're off on page here. The Markey-Liu and Warren Smith bills, and press President Biden to codify no first use doctrine, possibly during the nuclear posture review. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Let me now introduce Kennette Benedict. Kennette?
Thank you, David, and the organizers of this conference. I'm really delighted to be here and with the panel members today. There are several attractive features about adopting a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. First, to make such a pledge a reality, to implement it, practical steps would need to be taken to reduce and remove the temptation to use nuclear weapons first, including reducing launch readiness, decoupling warheads from missiles, removing ICBMs altogether from nuclear forces, as Bill Perry has suggested, and even removing nuclear weapons from the military and placing them in civilian custody, as they were in the earliest days of the nuclear age. And I want to come back to that a little bit later. Second, this pledge will also make good on a promise to the American people who believe today that nuclear weapons are to be used only to deter others from striking us first and only in retaliation for such a strike. In fact, a recent poll reveals that 63% of Americans oppose the first use of nuclear weapons by the United States. And third, perhaps most important for the health of our democracy, by enacting such a policy, Congress will be stepping up to its constitutional responsibility to declare war, to raise and support armed forces, and to make rules for the regulation of those forces. Now, our current nuclear policies assume that through presidential action and congressional funding, we do enjoy civilian control of war-making in the military, as the founders envisioned. It's the president, the civilian representative of the people, not the military, who has the sole authority to choose how and when to use nuclear weapons. Likewise, Congress has the authority to provide or withhold funding of nuclear weapons systems, thus exerting control over war-making powers. In theory, this may seem sufficient, but in practice, there are questions about how much civilian leaders control these decisions. In addition, current policies, as described in the nuclear posture reviews, assume nuclear weapons are weapons of war, rather than weapons of mass slaughter and genocide. And understanding the difference may lead us to think anew about the uses of nuclear weapons. So I want to take a few minutes here to explore these two assumptions about civilian control and about nuclear weapons as warfighting weapons, to move a bit beyond the problem of no first use, to ask whether nuclear weapons even have a place within a US or democratic constitutional framework. So let me turn first to the issue of civilian control. Immediately after World War II, President Harry Truman recognized the danger of having nuclear weapons in the hands of the military and instead placed them in the keeping of the Civilian Atomic Energy Commission. The ensuing legal and philosophical battle between civilian and military authorities for custody of nuclear weapons was, quote, a burning, acrimonious issue for years, as the Defense Department's own history put it. But by 1959, the military had taken effective control of nuclear warheads. Even before that, however, nuclear war planning by the Air Force in the early 1950s was not really discussed with Congress and often not even with the president. In fact, Fred Kaplan, in his most recent book, The Bomb, vividly details how little civilian control and input there is in planning for nuclear weapons use. The numbers of nuclear bombs, their launch readiness, as well as targeting plans were mostly hidden behind a veil of secrecy from the 1950s through the 1980s, and were simply baked into the program choices that a president had before him. Habits of thought about their use as military weapons were developed without substantial civilian oversight from congressional members and largely outside of the democratic process. To claim that civilians, in the single person of the president, for instance, control nuclear weapons decisions leading to war borders on fiction. Second, I want to suggest that the catastrophic consequences of nuclear bombing demand that we ask whether these, in fact, are weapons of warfighting, or are they instead weapons of mass slaughter and genocide? If they are not warfighting weapons, then they no longer should be under the control of the military and a president who serves as commander-in-chief. Rather, they need to be brought into the open and their uses debated by Congress and the public. In 1945, for example, at the very beginning of the atomic age, President Truman, the only president to have made the decision to drop atomic bombs, seemed to understand the horror of the weapons, and that's why he wanted civilians to make decisions about when to use them, as I noted earlier. And President Eisenhower called them weapons of genocide, not weapons of war. They, quote, crossed a line, he said, from military weapons to something entirely different. In earlier discussions, even before the bomb was used on Japan, as described by Alex Wellerstein in his new book about the history of nuclear secrecy, Lester Groves, the general overseeing the Manhattan Project, as well as Vannevar Bush, head of military research and development, along with President Franklin Roosevelt, wanted to, as Groves put it, keep from having a great political discussion as to how such a weapon could or should be used, because they thought this would have stopped all progress on the bomb. Wellerstein concludes, deliberation on something as important as the atomic bomb would preclude the possibility of its development and use. So this very small group of people in charge of the Manhattan Project seemed to understand how unpopular the bomb would be if the public understood what it could do. During World War II and the ensuing Cold War, some might argue there was no time to step back and try to understand if and whether these ever more powerful weapons had a role in warfighting. The fear of Nazi Germany and then of the Soviets and the race to keep up with their growing arsenals narrowed our vision. It also narrowed debate about nuclear weapons. But stepping back now, perhaps we can have that great political discussion. We can open the aperture and ask, under what conditions is mass slaughter, is genocide justified or acceptable? Is there a place in our Constitution for conducting genocide in the name of the American people? Is there, in fact, a place for nuclear weapons in our democracy? In closing, I hope that proposing and enacting a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons can lead us to broader questions about their uses, about secrecy, about civilian control, and about public participation in the most consequential decisions a country can make. Answers to these questions may lead us to ask whether nuclear weapons are compatible at all with our democratic institutions. And a final thought, Thomas Jefferson observed, though written constitutions may be violated in moments of passion or delusion, yet they furnish a text to which those who are watchful may again rally and recall the people. Our country seems to have suffered a 75-year moment of delusion about nuclear weapons, but today we are called upon to rally and recall the people to reconstitute and improve our democracy. Thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thanks so much, Kennette. Well, we will start off with a question for Tong from Jackie Cabasso. What would it take for U.S. declaratory policy of no first use to be viewed as credible by the Chinese government?
Thank you. I think that's a great question. You know, China has made a lot of requests about U.S. adopting no first use as a very important component of a future arms control discussion with China. But China has never said anything about how, you know, whether China would trust such an American no first use policy once adopted. I don't think China would just trust a political rhetorical commitment from the United States on no first use. So the key question really is, you know, how the two countries can agree on a set of criteria to make their respective no first use policies credible and trustworthy. Mm-hmm. If countries are serious about discussing no first use, they should start with this discussion about credibility criteria. And I know, you know, U.S. have a lot of questions about the credibility of Chinese no first use, and China certainly would have such questions too. So, you know, they still have, you know, domestic political issues with each other's, you know, with no first use. So we don't need to start with asking each other to for example, China, you know, we don't need to start with China insisting U.S. immediately adopting no first use, because U.S. faces a lot of domestic issues and you know, security concerns from its allies that U.S. needs to accommodate. But if they can start discussing this set of common criteria, I think that would pave the ground for any practical progress on the issue of no first use.
Thank you, Tong. Doug Mulholland asks a question. Recently, the Colonial Pipeline was shut down by scammers and blackmailed. How much more secure is control of nuclear weapons? And I suppose that might be for any of the panelists.
Zia, you want to take it?
I see Kennette was waving, so perhaps you want to speak to this question first.
Let me just offer a couple of comments. Certainly the command and control system and the military attempt to keep that system secure. But I have authority from one of the students in my class, actually, who was seconded from the military and took my class, that at that time, the command and control experienced about 1 million attempts to hack that system every day. So it is constant. I mean, it's a constant barrage of attempts to hack into that system. It's very, you know, kind of a challenge for any hacker. The military command obviously reassures us all the time that it is not a problem, but I think that it certainly is, and it's something that we should be aware of. And another reason why we need to stand down these nuclear weapons, to take them off of high launch readiness, to decouple warheads, to just all the things that we've talked about, to ensure that either by accident or, as Bill Perry says, by blundering, we would enter into a nuclear war.
So,
Thanks,
David,
Kennette.
if I might, let me just add one observation.
Go ahead, Zia.
Nuclear command and control systems are incredibly complicated, interlinked, technical and human systems. And the idea that you can understand how such a complicated system of both machinery and people will actually reliably function under all circumstances is an illusion. So the answer to the question is, we don't actually know how robust and reliable it is. People try to make it robust and reliable, but there's no way of actually knowing how far and how well you have achieved this, given the fact of the system's complexity. Failure will be a normal outcome in such complex systems. And it will happen for reasons that you haven't anticipated, and you can't anticipate them because it is so complicated and because it involves people. So to just give you one last example, it only takes one person with a USB stick, a flash drive, and your entire system might be compromised. And so the idea that you can actually plan and manage such a complicated system is just, like I said, an illusion. And to make a judgment about how safe or secure it might be only adds to that illusion of control. It just serves the purpose of system managers to create the illusion of control, because their job is to try and control it.
Thanks, Zia. Thanks, Kennette. This for, I think, Tong and Joseph both, from Johannes Allefeld. At a meeting of the Disarmament Committee of the Socialist International in 2010, Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Zhang indicated that China would engage in discussions on nuclear arms control once the US and Russia had gone down to 500 warheads each. Do you think this position is still valid, or has it probably changed under Xi, aiming for a greater nuclear arsenal of maybe 1,000 or more?
Thank you. I can start. It looks like the Chinese criteria for itself joining arms control and starting to reduce its nuclear arsenal have changed over time. Initially, in the early 1980s, the Chinese public position was China would join a nuclear disarmament process once US and the Soviet Union cut their nuclear arsenals by half. And you mentioned this criteria has moved to US and Russia cutting their nuclear weapons to 500. And very recently, senior Chinese officials from the foreign ministry said that either the US and Russia need to reduce their nuclear arsenals to the level of Chinese nuclear arsenal, which is about 300 nuclear weapons according to open source research, or China should raise these nuclear arsenals to the levels of US and Russian nuclear arsenals in order, before China can join arms control as an equal partner of the other nuclear powers. So that's further, I think, raised the bar for China's joining nuclear arms control. So the criteria have evolved over time. I think especially under the current political leadership, which embraces a very power-centric mindset, the political level in nuclear arms control and nuclear reduction appears very low. So it's maybe very hard to discuss quantitative limit or reduction of nuclear weapons, which also means that we may make more progress if we start with talking about nuclear postures, including how to broaden the adoption of no first use policy. If I may, I would like to add one quick word about the previous question about cyber and nuclear command control. I think today many nuclear countries are thinking about how they can use advanced cyber technologies to deliberately interfere with each other's nuclear command control system, because it would offer them another option of disabling the other's capacity to launch their nuclear weapons. And this is very dangerous, because if a country detects any traces of cyber interference in its nuclear command control system, it might quickly lose its confidence in its capacity to execute a nuclear war, which might even raise the risk of overreaction during a crisis. So the first step appears to be that nuclear weapon states need to make promises and reassurances to each other and renounce the option of using cyber technologies to deliberately interfere and even degrade each other's nuclear command control system. Thank you.
I'd like to comment that maybe from a different angle. I just put into the chat the URL for the Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy. And among other things you'll find there is a record of very frequent provocative military actions, principally by the United States, which could all too easily, in fact, have led to incidents which could escalate beyond control. So I think we, as happened during the Cold War, the need to engage in common security negotiations and discussions with Chinese leaders to explore how to reduce the tensions that could trigger a military incident that could all too easily escalate and into first use. And in that context, just to say, in previous conversations, Tong Zhao has talked about the importance of the U.S. moving to a first strike doctrine, which could create the environment in which greater strategic stability talks could take place. So we need to understand the larger, as Zia was saying before, the larger political and geopolitical context of what's going on, and to recognize that if we're going to prevent nuclear war, we have to come at it from a number of different directions.
Well, there are still a few more questions. We are out of time, unfortunately, for questions if we're going to get on with the rest of the program. So thank you, Tong, Zia, Kennette, Joseph, for just another enlightening, stellar panel. We'll try